Hello, fellow music fans. Kevin from Storytellers Union once again, by the Christmas tree, still holding on as we get through the holidays. First, Happy New Year to everyone. Hope it was great. But before we get too far into 2023, we are looking back at 2022, specifically the best albums of 2022. And before I begin, just a reminder that if you didn't see our honorable mentions as well as the episode on albums number 30 through 21, check those out here on the channel. And now, without further ado, we get into the top 20, starting with a debut at number 20, the Linda Lindas, Growing Up. And an album has not been more appropriately titled than Growing Up, because first of all, if you don't know the story of the Linda Lindas, don't get distracted by it. It's important to know, but sometimes I think it overshadows the fact that they're just a really good and really fun band. But the story, however, is intriguing. They're all young women. In fact, when this album was recorded, they were either teenagers or preteens. And so that gets a lot of the attention. They first were spotted because of a video that went viral. They performed the song Racist Sexist Boy at their local library, and that was posted to the library's YouTube channel. When that went viral, everything that's followed since, all the attention, this album has all been the result of that. But this is not a gimmick. These women have incredible insight, and it gives you incredible insight into voices that are not heard very often, not just that of young women and what young women in this country face, but particularly these young women who are of either Chinese, Mexican, or Salvadorian descent. So they really do give a perspective and provide a voice for something that's really underheard. And it's not just the song Racist Sexist Boy, which obviously would speak for itself. And it does, that song particularly has the hallmarks of punk music and protest, but it really is more, in this case, I would think cathartic, the music that they like. It's empowering messages that these young ladies sing about all throughout. And again, all of this would be for naught if it wasn't for the fact that despite some heavy messages, for the most part, these are empowerment anthems. This is also fun and catchy bubblegum punk, and definitely worth a listen. Also worth a listen, number 19, and probably the album that is maybe most difficult to assess fairly. This is one of those situations where I am going to attempt to separate the art from the artist, because after initial acclaim for Arcade Fire's We, when it was released back in May, allegations surfaced against lead singer and songwriter Win Butler. So taking those allegations and trying to move them to the side. Honestly, if not for those allegations overshadowing this record, it might even rank higher on my list. But again, trying to separate that art from the artist, looking at just the music itself here, what we have with We is the best Arcade Fire album since the album of the year, Grammy Award winning The Suburbs. The last couple of records Arcade Fire have put out have ventured further from their roots and further into dance and pop music, further into the use of keyboards as the primary coloring instrument. This returns back to more of a stripped down sound that will remind you of things Funeral, again, The Suburbs, and the songwriting throughout is very, very strong. These are arena ready sing-along anthems in the bombastic vein, really, of the prime Arcade Fire material. So your mileage may vary depending on if you can separate the art from the artist. If you can, then We is worth a listen. Number 18, First Aid Kit. Ever since the 1950s, when rock and roll began and the Everly Brothers hit the scene, you just cannot beat sibling harmonies in rock and pop music. And in First Aid Kit, that tradition continues. You have Swedish sisters, Joanna and Clara Soderberg, and they have been for years now making beautiful music together, and usually of a country folk vein. And with Palomino, they continue to stray further from that sound. And I wouldn't say completely from the sound, because that is still the core of who they are. The harmonies are still at the center of everything that they do. However, that folk palette this time around has added some more rock and pop elements to it. In fact, specifically those elements that you might have found in the 1970s. Think Fleetwood Mac when Stevie was doing the singing, or even a bit of 70s disco. So whether you're talking FM radio or the dance floor, the 70s definitely influenced this album a lot. Not to say that they don't still do the country folk thing really well. In fact, sort of a spiritual sequel to one of their bigger hits, Emmy Lou. They have on this album Wild Horses 2, which is sort of a Graham Parsons tribute and in many ways a sequel to that song. And that very much follows in the same vein of that heart-rendering, heartbreaking, in fact, folk rock. Not folk rock is my number 17 album. And in fact, if you heard this album and you go, is this the new Radiohead? You'd be forgiven, because in all but name only, yes, this is the new Radiohead. But this band is The Smile, and it is comprised of 3 members, 2 of which are the primary architects of Radiohead, which is why it sounds like Radiohead. Now, not all Radiohead side projects do sound like Radiohead. And in fact, when Tom York and Johnny Greenwood, they typically make music that is sort of outside the bounds of what they would do with their main gig. However, with the 2 of them in the same band this time around, it definitely leans more to sounding like Radiohead. And if Radiohead over the last couple of decades have become more and more esoteric, and strewn a little farther and farther away from using guitar at the center of their music, it is refreshing for a lot of Radiohead fans, I'm sure, to hear the propulsion on The Smile's A Light for Attracting Attention, because it sounds like Radiohead back when they still cranked up the guitars. Not that it is all hard charging, because it is not. There's still a lot of atmosphere here. Think the Bends era, for example. I think that that's the album that I would probably attune it the most to in Radiohead's catalog. So this is more than just a side project for Radiohead fans to pay attention to if you like the band. This is the best side project from Radiohead that any of the members have ever produced. And the good news is The Smile is not considered a one-off. In interviews, they have made it clear that this is an ongoing concern. So even if this return to guitar-based music doesn't bleed back into Radiohead's own material, we can look forward to more from The Smile. And hopefully it is as strong and as arresting as A Light for Attracting Attention, because attract attention, indeed, it does. Number 16 on my best albums of 2022 list is Lucius, Second Nature. So the close harmonies of Lucius have always been their calling card. That is still in effect here on Second Nature. However, those harmonies have never been used quite this way. This is a dance record, and that is not something that you would have ever really attributed to Lucius in the past. You can give part of the credit to that to Brandi Carlile, yes, that Brandi Carlile, who produces this album, from coaxing this out of Lucius. However, Lucius members Jess Wolfe and Holly Lacing, they have, given them the credit for taking chances and stepping out of their comfort zones. The 2 ladies have experienced a lot since the last time they went into the recording studio. And because of that, the writing that they did for this record is really steeped in heartbreak. Holly had actually experienced a divorce. She divorced the drummer, who is still in the band. So that has to be a little difficult for that former couple as these songs were being recorded, because they lay bare what they've been through. And they knew, because the subject matter would be so heavy, that they did not want to make a sad record, or a record that was, maybe even just difficult to listen to from being so uncomfortable. So they decided to cut the heaviness a bit by taking the lyrics and doing the complete opposite with the music, so that maybe it would lighten up the material some. So if you really dig into the stories, you can have your heart broken, and if you decide that you just want to zone out, you can just dance your cares away. It's a clever trick that really works, and definitely one of the best albums of 2022. Number 16, that is Lucia's Second Nature. Check it out, because Brandi Carlile not only produces, if you're a fan of her or Sheryl Crow, two folks that obviously have been quite an influence on Lucia's, both Sheryl and Brandi also appear on the album as well. So that's worth checking out. Moving on to number 15, The Lone Bellow, Love Songs for Losers. I may have actually underrated this one. I just listened to it yesterday. I've been reviewing all of my choices to make sure I got my order right, and I'm just tempted to say that this album is even better than number 15. That's just how good Love Songs for Losers is. The trio that comprise Love Songs for Losers, they all three sing and all three provide great harmonies. And typically it's Zach Williams at the lead, but the other two members also take certain leads and write certain materials, and that's always allowed them to have a lot of variety on their records. But this is probably the most variety they've ever had on record, and it is the best record that they have done to date. In fact, all the band members bring forward career best material here, and it's really hard to pick a favorite. The album opens with the song Honey, which the synthesizer in that song, as well as the little guitar motif in there, reminds me a little bit of like late 80s era Bruce Springsteen and E Street Band, which of course is to my liking. There's some 50s influences there. Particular, there's like a Buddy Holly like reverb on the song Unicorn, another one of the highlights. Dreaming may be my favorite song, which is just a heartbreaking ballad on there. But Homesick is maybe the one that's most primed to break this band through to what they deserve. It is sing-along pop rock. It's very rootsy. The whole album is rather unclassifiable because they managed to throw so many songs in there in so many different styles. But the one thread that holds them all together is the lyrics are of a more serious nature. Again, much like the album I mentioned at number 16 there with Lucius, they managed to cut a lot of the seriousness by making sure they don't forget the fun as well. And that's what they do by mixing up these genres the way that they do. Quite a listen, and every song catchy. A lot of earworms on this one. Go check out the Lone Bellow Love Songs for Losers. You'll be a loser if you don't. I'm just saying. Number 14. Jack White, Fear of the Dawn. If you watched my honorable mentions episode, you know that Jack White put out 2 albums this year. The lesser of those, in my mind, was the acoustic album that he did that was still worth listening to, but Fear of the Dawn is the one that really gets your attention, and it almost grabs you by the throat because it is overstuffed with ideas. In some ways, it is just insane. And the last time that Jack White, prior to this year and the 2 albums he released, the last time he released an album, it was similarly bonkers, and also was the worst album he'd ever done in his career. That was Boarding House Reach. He'd never been so panned by critics and so confounded his even hardest defenders, in that it was almost inscrutable. I don't know what to say about that album other than he tried a little bit of everything and none of it worked. So what's different this time? He's still trying a little bit of everything. That kitchen sink approach this time, though, yields memorable songs in most cases. Now, not everything works, and there are probably some editing that could have even made this album even higher on my list. But for the most part, this time around, he doesn't forget that these songs need to stand on their own, despite the experimentation, and they need to stand on their own as successful and catchy numbers. And for the most part, that's exactly what they are. It is, in fact, refreshing to hear Jack crank up the guitars and play the part of guitar hero again, just like back in the old White Stripes days. But it's not repeating himself, not by a long shot, as there's not a moment on here that doesn't feel like he is trying hard. And even when he fails, it's never anything less than interesting. Whereas Boarding House Reach was just failure from beginning to end and was not engaging to the listener. You will be enthralled with this from the opening number all the way through the end. And there is a lot of things to highlight on here. Again, everything's either masterful or at the very least interesting and worth a listen. Moving along, also worth a listen, number 13, the biggest return, I think, of any of the acts on my list, a welcome return. Did you forget how great Tears for Fears were? Everybody Wants to Rule the World and the other hits from the 1980s. That's what people remember. But Tears for Fears had several albums after that that were also strong before Acrimony got involved and the band broke up. They have not made an album in 17 years. This is that album, The Tipping Point. And it came together under heartbreaking circumstances. One of the co-founders, Roland, lost his wife tragically to alcoholism and then went to rehab himself. This hurt had Kurt Smith reach out to him, and the two former friends and former co-writers reignited their bond and began writing songs again, not sure exactly how they were going to re-enter into the world. And so glad that they did put this out back into the world, that they addressed the tragedy and the heartbreak and their dissolving relationship and their reconciliation, all encapsulated on The Tipping Point. And they managed to update their sound without sounding like they're chasing modern trends. They also managed to still sound like the Tears for Fears that you remember from the 80s and early 90s without sounding like they're trying to ape their glory days or just doing an exercise in nostalgia. To be able to balance that line and do both at the same time is quite a trick. What they have is something that sounds exactly like you want Tears for Fears to sound. It is glorious pop rock and catchy. Every song will embed itself into your head and you'll find yourself singing it for days. And they have not missed a beat. And hopefully this is just the beginning, and it does not take another 17 years to hear from Tears for Fears. Again, if you forgot just how good this band was, this is not only their first album in 17 years, it is their best album since their 1989 classic, Sowing the Seeds of Love. I will go on record as saying that. And with that, we move on to number 12. And that album comes from somebody that has been represented on my list in the past, usually fronting his main band, The Hold Steady. However, Craig Finn, A Legacy of Reynolds, is the latest from Craig as a part of his solo work. It is his third, I believe, solo record, and by far the best of the three. The other two have been good and progressively better on the second one, and then this third one, which is really, in some ways, he said the ending of a trilogy that he was hoping to tell, is the best of the bunch, as it's the most varied of the bunch. Craig has always been one of rock and roll's most premier songwriters. He crams more detail in the briefest amount of time of anyone you'll ever hear. Sometimes that gets lost in the fact that he's screaming as part of The Hold Steady. They're a live act that must be seen to be believed, bordering on punk. They're definitely hard rock, high energy. And so on his solo work, he dials it down to the point that you probably pay more attention to the lyrics, which is definitely something you must do. Probably the best written record, if I had to just go on lyrics alone, of any album that is going to be represented in my top 30. A primary example would be the opening track, which is Messing with the Settings, which uses as a metaphor factory presets as dealing with fate. And it tells a story from beginning to end, including a twist at the end that honestly any screenwriter would be envious of, in order to get that level of detail into 3 to 4 minutes, what would take some an entire movie or novel to unfurl. And it's incredibly impressive to watch him do this. That is the first track. And then to watch him repeat that trick over and over again through the duration of all the songs album, all the songs on the album is really quite a feat. So again, if you're a fan of the Hold Steady, you're probably interested in Craig Finn anyway. But if you're just a fan of well-written stories, then Craig Finn doesn't sing so much as he speaks to you. You definitely want to check out A Legacy of Rentals and hear what are some of the greatest lyrics penned on an album that came out in 2022. With that, we're going to end with number 11, the last on this episode before we delve into the top 10 of my top 30 albums of 2022. And number 11 is someone else who has appeared on this list in previous years because he does such consistently strong work. And that is Father John Misty, this time with his album Chloe in the Next 20th Century. The man, otherwise known as Josh Tillman, normally puts out work that is very much singer-songwriters, 70s indie rock, kind of acoustic-based adult contemporary indie rock, if you would, and does so with a bit of a smirk. The Father John Misty mask that he wears is a bit of a character, a sardonic type of individual who looks very cynically at the world. These albums are typically filled with brilliant lyrics, a lot of very sharp one-liners, and again, just a lot of cynicism, which in this case is almost completely absent. Which makes it very much unlike the Father John Misty albums that you may be more familiar with in his prior work. So if you haven't appreciated what he does there, and you really should, but if you haven't appreciated his work in the past, then don't set on Chloe in the Next 20th Century for thinking that you're not going to like it. Give it a listen and see if it might be more to your liking, because this is earnest. It is not cynical. And it is also not based in a lot of the signifiers of his previous music. In fact, if you were to akin it to any type of music, you'd probably have to go back into the pre rock and roll era. Think like 1940s era, like film scores. There is complete chamber orchestras involved in the recording of this work. It's very steeped in jazz and movie scores. And if that interests you at all, or if you're wondering what in the world Josh Tillman would sound like if he stopped being so cynical and stripped everything back into, a kaleidoscope of colors and sounds from pre-rock and roll, then this is quite the arresting listen that you should make sure you pick up. And that would be my number 11 album of the year, Chloe and the Next 20th Century by Father John Misty. With that, we're bringing this episode to a close and leaves only one more episode that we will premiere next week. Be sure to join us because we're getting into the top 10. It's the nitty-gritty time. It's the best albums from 2022. You can count down 10 through 1 with me. Let me know what you think. Be sure to like and comment and let us know what you think about this episode as well as all the others we've posted here. We're going to wrap it up next time around, and I will see you then. Thanks for tuning in.